Hey friends, tonight we begin a journey through time, deep into the frozen heart of the Middle Ages, to witness the remarkable resilience of everyday people, the medieval peasants. These were not knights or kings, not scholars or nobles. They were ordinary men, women, and children who endured some of the harshest winters in history with nothing but determination, ingenuity, and raw will to survive. So before we begin, hit the like button and subscribe only if you truly enjoy this kind of storytelling. And drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see how far our stories reach. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan or some soft ambient hum. Let your breath slow. Let's step into a world where winter was not just a season, it was a test of survival. The bitter beginning. Forget what you've seen in movies, jousting tournaments, feasts with goblets of wine, and dancing troubadours. That was not the world most people lived in. For the average peasant, winter wasn't a poetic snowfall. It was an annual punishment from nature. Each year, without fail, it returned like a stern schoolmaster, testing everyone's strength, resolve, and luck. Imagine this. You live in a tiny hut, slapped together with mud, sticks, and dreams. The walls are so thin, you could hear a bird cough outside. Insulation? None. Windows? Maybe a hole covered in animal hide. Heat? If you had a fire going, great. If not, well, you were just one stiff breeze away from becoming a medieval icicle. And yet, they endured. A night to forget. Night was the worst. The wind screamed through every crack in the walls like a banshee. Darkness swallowed the fields and the forests. Inside, the only light flickered from a dying fire, barely strong enough to warm the toes of the person sitting closest. If you were on the other side of the room, you might as well have been sleeping outside with your cows. The beds weren't much help either. Imagine lying on a sack of hay, stuffed with straw, maybe with a few rushes added in for flair. No mattress, no pillow, definitely no duvet. And as a bonus, it probably came with fleas. Luxury? No. Survival. Barely dressed. To not die peasants didn't dress for style. They dressed for not dying. Your wardrobe was simple. Rough spun tunics made of scratchy wool, a thick cloak that probably smelled like every animal in your barn, and maybe, just maybe, a sheepskin if you were lucky or had done something noble in a past life. You layered these like armor, one piece over another, trying to become a walking onion of warmth. It didn't really work, but it was better than nothing. Forget boots. Many peasants just wrapped their feet in rags and hoped for the best. And laundry? Not happening. Washing clothes meant breaking through ice at the river, soaking your only tunic, and waiting days for it to dry. If it didn't just freeze into a shirt-shaped sculpture. Better to stink and stay warm. Most peasant homes were made using a method called wattle and daub. Basically, weave sticks together into a wall, then smear it with a delightful mix of mud, straw, and, yes, animal dung. The dung wasn't there for decoration. It was sticky, insulating, and free. Welcome to medieval innovation, but even with all that effort, the wind always found a way in. It would slip through cracks, dance over dirt floors, and settle into your bones like a cold curse. The roof might leak, the walls might crumble, the floor just compacted dirt that turned to mud in heavy rain or snow. Medieval peasants didn't build houses to be warm, they built them to not collapse, and sometimes they didn't even win that battle. Want to know what your floor felt like? Imagine sleeping on a cold marsh. Straw mats helped, but they flattened quickly, got moldy faster, and created a crunchy soundtrack to your misery. Some homes used dried rushes. These were layered again and again without removing the old ones, building up a bedding ecosystem of decomposing plants, bugs, and small creatures brave enough to call your floor home. It was like a medieval carpet. If your carpet was slightly alive and definitely smelly, and beds, they were often just wooden frames filled with, you guessed it, more straw. In this freezing chaos, one thing mattered above all else: the fire. It wasn't just warmth, it was life. There was no fireplace, no chimney, just a pit or a few stones where the flames lived. Smoke didn't rise gracefully through the air. It hovered, curled, and clung to everything. If it was feeling lazy, it settled right into your lungs. It hurt to breathe, but it also killed fleas. So, silver lining, this fire was your kitchen, your heat source, your light, and your entertainment. Families gathered around it, not for coziness, but to make sure no one froze to death before morning. Letting it go out wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. And reigniting it meant flint steel, kindling, and enough prayer to rival a cathedral. Service peasants got clever. Before bed, they would bank the fire, not in a vault, literally burying embers under a layer of ash, like tucking in a sleeping baby of heat. If done right, the fire could be revived in the morning with a bit of poking and dry wood. If done wrong, the cold came rushing in like a ghost, with a grudge. Banking the fire became a family ritual, each member trained in the sacred art of ember preservation. Do it wrong, and you didn't just wake up cold, you woke up hated by everyone else in the house. It was the medieval equivalent of forgetting to charge your phone, except the consequence was frostbite, body heat, or bust-no central heating. No problem. Medieval peasants had a solution: each other. Sleeping wasn't about comfort. It was about survival. Families, livestock, and sometimes neighbors packed into the warmest part of the hut, like layers in a lasagna. Little ones were stuffed in the middle like tiny heat batteries. Grandparents were layered on the outside if they could handle it. If Cousin Merrick dropped by unexpectedly, well, scoot over. There's always room for one more under the goat-smelling blanket. Personal space didn't exist. You slept where you could. If your sibling's elbow jabbed you in the ribs, you were just grateful it wasn't a hoof. Speaking of hooves, you didn't just share a room with your family. You shared it with your animals: cows, goats, pigs, chickens. Anything that generated heat was welcome, not as pets, as radiators. The warmth was vital, and so was the security. If your goat was sleeping beside you, it was less likely to be stolen during the night. It smelled. It was noisy, but it was necessary. Imagine drifting off with a pig snoring next to your head and a chicken nested in your hood. Now, imagine waking up and stepping barefoot into something mysterious on the floor. Congratulations, you've just had the authentic medieval morning. Peasants didn't take the cold lying down, well, not without layering mud first. They jammed moss, cloth scraps, grass, even animal hair into every crevice of the walls. Some even smeared extra layers of mud and dung outside like it was high-end plaster. It wasn't pretty, but it helped. Windows were tiny holes, if they existed at all, covered with stretched cowhide or thick cloth soaked in fat. It blocked the wind and gave the room a pleasant aroma of meat and desperation. Every crack was patched. Every breeze was an enemy. They didn't win every night, but they refused to go down without a fight in medieval times. Sleep wasn't guaranteed, not because of stress or screens, but because the cold quite literally crept in like death on tiptoe. Survival wasn't about wrapping yourself in luxury. It was about working in shifts, breathing carefully, eating wisely, and sticking together, even if that meant curling up next to a steaming goat in a straw-filled hut that smelled like a petting zoo after a thunderstorm. This was medieval winter, and the next phase of survival came down to something much more dangerous than just staying warm, staying awake. Shift work in the dark ages. In today's world, we romanticize the idea of everyone going to bed together. Lights off, peace at last. Not so in a peasant home. The fire didn't keep itself alive. Let it die, and the cold would creep in. Quick, cruel, and potentially fatal. Restarting it wasn't simple. No matches, no lighters, just frozen fingers, flint, steel, and furious prayer. So families did what armies do. They slept in shifts, while some tried to catch a few shivering hours under damp blankets. Others sat watch. They fed the flames, patched up drafty gaps in the walls, and poked at timbers with long sticks like grumpy wizards. The house never fully slept, and the house never fully warmed, but it stayed alive. The reluctant fire keeper. Being on fire duty wasn't glamorous. You weren't a hero. You were just tired, cranky, and probably regretting every life choice that led you to sit barefoot on a dirt floor at 3 a.m. while everyone else snored. Sometimes even children were dragged into the mix. If you could hold a stick, you could guard the flame. And if you let the fire go out, let's just say your siblings wouldn't let you forget it, especially if they woke up with ice on their eyebrows. When breathing could kill you. The cold outside was one thing, but medieval peasants soon learned something terrifying. Cold air could kill you from the inside. Breathing deeply in freezing temperatures meant dragging icy air directly into your lungs. That could mean bronchitis, pneumonia, or worse, illnesses that, in a world without antibiotics, often led straight to the grave. So, peasants adapted their breathing too. Survival. Breathing no yoga, no mindfulness apps. Just a raw instinct for not dying. The key. Shallow, slow breaths through the nose. Nose breathing gently warmed the air before it reached the lungs. Mouth breathing. That was how you coughed yourself into a fever dream and woke up dead. Even in sleep, they covered their faces, wrapping scarves or cloaks around their mouths, creating a soggy, woolen breathing mask that collected condensation but spared their lungs. It wasn't comfortable, But it was survival, the sleeping strategy. If the fire, the breath, and the blankets held together, you had one more tool in your frost-fighting arsenal. Midnight calories. Yes, food was fuel. And medieval people discovered that eating a heavy, hot, fatty meal right before bed could help you retain warmth through the night. Because digestion, it turns out, generates heat, feasting on frost. So, what did peasants eat before turning in? Not gourmet cuisine, that's for sure. Think thick, gritty porridge made from oats or barley, dense bread, turnips, cabbage, dried beans, maybe a chunk of salted pork, or a handful of dried fish if it was a good week. No spices, no sugar, no dainty. Spoonfuls, just slabs of medieval calories, shoveled in like armor. Did it taste good? Probably not. Did it work? Absolutely. Because a stomach churning with cabbage stew was a furnace in disguise, generating internal warmth that helped your body hold on for one more night. Night time. Culinary risks. Of course, there was a downside. Late night meals sometimes meant late night dreams. Wild, vivid, occasionally terrifying dreams, brought on by a belly doing battle with half-rotten vegetables and ancient bread. But when the alternative was freezing to death, a few nightmares were an acceptable trade. Even the children were made to eat, whether they liked it or not. Little Thomas didn't want turnips. Too bad. Turnips or frostbite. That was the parenting philosophy of the day. Homemade. Heating Hack's modern world has hot water bottles and electric blankets. Medieval peasants. Heated rocks and hayboxes. The haybox tricka. Haybox was the medieval version of a slow cooker and a thermos combined. Take a wooden crate, line it thickly with hay, nestle a pot of hot food inside it, cover the top, voila. Hours later, it would still be warm. But this hay insulation technique had another use. Heated rocks. The rock ritual. Before bed, someone, usually a child with very bad luck, would toss a heavy, flat rock into the heart of the fire. After it roasted like a pizza stone for an hour, it was carefully pulled out using tongs or cloths and wrapped in layers of rag. Then, it was slipped beneath the straw mattress or dropped at the foot of the bed. Instant heat. Temporary bliss. If you did it wrong, you burned your foot or started a house fire. But if you did it right, you had a medieval heating pad. And maybe, just maybe, a few precious hours of uninterrupted sleep. Strategic sleeping. Not everyone got equal access to warmth. Sleeping near the fire was prime real estate, reserved for infants, elders, and the sick. They were the most vulnerable, and everyone knew it. Parents, teens, stronger adults fanned out from there in concentric circles of heat. Pets and livestock often snuck in too, claiming corners and radiating warmth like furry little heaters. And you, if you were lucky, you got to sleep in the middle. If you were unlucky, you were against the far wall. The medieval version of camping beside an open freezer. Goat braith and chicken. Let's not forget the real roommates. The animals. Cows lounged near the walls, chewing cud. Goats burped beside the fire. Chickens nested in the rafters. Pigs snored with the enthusiasm of tired truckers. The smell, unholy. The noise, constant. But the warmth, irreplaceable. The people of the village understood this simple, smelly math. More animals inside, fewer frozen toes in the morning. Sharing the cold survival wasn't a solo mission, and it wasn't just about your family either. It was about the village. The whole community was part of the winter defense system, like a medieval support network made of food, gossip, and embers. The watchful eye villages had unofficial watchers, elders too frail to work, kids not old enough to help with the fields, or sharp-eyed women who just knew everyone's business. They kept track of who was coughing too hard, who hadn't shown up at the market, whose chimney hadn't smoked in 2 days. If someone's fire went out, neighbors brought embers, or even entire families inside for the night. There was no privacy, but there was no abandonment either. Food, sharing, and communal charity. When things got really dire, when the winter stretched too long, or the snow blocked the roads, villagers pooled resources. Salted meat, dried vegetables, old cheese, crusty loaves of rye bread, too hard to chew but too important to waste. One hot pot, one shared meal, just enough calories to keep everyone from slipping into the sleep that never ended. The poorest were fed, the weakest were carried. Even long-held grudges often froze over, because if you didn't help your neighbor through the night, who would help you when the wind came for your roof? Prayers in the cold. They did everything they could, and when that wasn't enough, they prayed every night before crawling under straw and scratchy blankets. Families knelt together on icy floors. They prayed for the fire, for the children, for the walls to hold, and the cows to stay warm. They asked saints to guard them from death by cold. They asked God to let them see the sun. They didn't ask for comfort, just survival. And somehow, night after night, they held on. We've spent the night beside the fire. We've watched the embers. There were winters so cruel, so merciless, that they didn't just take fingers and toes. They took entire villages. Sometimes all the moss-stuffed cracks, firebanking, rituals, and steaming stews weren't enough. Sometimes the cold won, and when it didn't just nip at the edges of comfort. It devoured the frozen mornings. There were mornings when neighbors would venture out, boots crunching on frost, and knock on a door that didn't open. Inside, silence, a family wrapped around one another in layers of cloaks, straw, and stillness. A mother cradling a child who hadn't stirred. A father's outstretched hand still near the hearth, reaching for warmth that never returned. They didn't freeze all at once. It was slow, quiet, a slipping away into sleep that didn't come back. The blackened limbs. Even among the survivors, winter left its mark. Frostbite wasn't just a word. It was a punishment. First, the tingling, then the pain, then the numbness. Then your fingers or toes turned black, dying while still attached to your body. Some lost ears, noses, hands. Children who survived the cold often bore scars for life, missing digits, frozen memories, and in some villages, a grim respect for the limbless. Survivors who walked, hobbled, or crawled through winter's wrath and lived to tell about it. Collapse of a house, even the homes themselves, couldn't always endure. Thatched roofs, sagging under heavy snow. sometimes gave way in the night. Timber cracked, walls folded, and when a house collapsed in winter, it wasn't just a structural failure, it was a death sentence. No one could rebuild in a storm. No one could shovel fast enough. No one came because everyone else was fighting to survive under their own failing roofs. The whisper of hunger cold wasn't the only killer. It had a twin, a silent, gnawing, all-consuming thing. Hunger, the empty storehouse. In good years, food stores were enough. Turnips, salted pork, barley, cabbages shriveling in the cellar. In bad years, nothing. Crops failed. Livestock perished. Salt stores ran out. And the hunger came creeping through the village like a shadow with claws. Children cried with hollow bellies. Elders gave up their meals for the young. Mothers chewed bark in private, pretending they weren't starving too. Some winters were so bleak that neighbors stopped visiting, no doubt of anger, but shame. No one wanted to admit they had nothing left to give. Desperate measures when famine truly dug in. The stories turned dark. Legends of people boiling leather shoes for soup, of families eating dried moss, of people going to sleep with bellies so empty they felt like echoes. And in the darkest corners of history, during years like 1315, whispers of cannibalism, neighbors disappearing, silences too long, eyes that refused to meet in the market the disease that followed. And if the cold didn't get you, and the hunger didn't find you, the sickness would, because freezing temperatures and cramped, smoky huts were a paradise for germs. The cough that killed. One cough could infect an entire house. Pneumonia, bronchitis, fever. These were not seasonal inconveniences. They were funeral invitations. There were no antibiotics, no clinics, no pharmacies, just onion teas, fire smoke, and whispered prayers. People coughed until they bled, shivered through nights, and slipped away in corners, under damp blankets. The smoke that saved and sickened, ironically, the very thing that warmed them, the fire, also made them sick. Without chimneys, smoke filled the air inside huts. It burned eyes, scorched lungs. Children grew up wheezing. Elders coughed through their last winters in a thick haze of wood smoke and desperation. It kept the fleas away, but it didn't keep death out. The strangest ally, filth. You'd think hygiene would save lives, but in medieval winter, dirt helped. The grimy barrier. People didn't wash during winter, not because they didn't care, because they couldn't. Bathing meant dragging water from a frozen stream, breaking ice, undressing in the cold and risking hypothermia just to rinse off some soot. So they didn't, and strangely, it helped. Layers of natural oils, sweat, and smoke clung to clothing. Over time, these layers sealed the fabric, creating a crude insulation. Peasants joked that by February, you weren't wearing a tunic, you were wearing history. It was disgusting, but it was warm. The unchanged underlayer. Most people didn't change their underclothes during winter. You just kept adding layers on top. By the end of February, you might have been wearing 5 or 6 layers. Crusty, itchy collection of months old, linen and wool held together by grime and prayers. It wasn't hygienic. It wasn't dignified. But it worked, and that was all that mattered. The final line, faith and, when the walls crumbled, the food ran out, and the fire flickered low, there was still faith. Prayers of the frozen every night in huts across the frozen land. Voices rose like smoke, thin, shaky, desperate. Peasants prayed not for wealth or power, but for something much simpler, a spark, a warm dawn, the life of a child who hadn't stirred in hours. They prayed to saints like Saint Nicholas, the protector of households, to Saint Apollonia when cold teeth cracked in the night, to God himself, whispering deals in the dark, spare us this winter, and I will be kinder, I will forgive, I will change. The rituals of hope, some sprinkled holy water near the hearth, others burned special candles all night, not for light, but for protection. Some marked doorways in chalk, hid trinkets beneath straw. Superstition met survival, and even when the cold pressed its face to the window, even when the fire shrank to embers, they believed, because sometimes faith was all that stood between despair and another sunrise. When entire villages vanished, there were years when winter didn't just kill a few, it erased. The spring discoveries, when the snow melted and the roads cleared, travelers would find them. Villages with no smoke, doors swinging open, cattle dead in the field, and inside the homes, stillness, entire families curled together in frozen silence, whole communities extinguished, no screams, no warning, just the quiet finality of a cold that refused to loosen its grip, a hardened acceptance. It sounds cruel now, but to them, it was expected. People understood that each winter might claim someone. They just hoped it wouldn't be them, or their child, or their friend. Death came like another neighbor, silent, wrapped in frost, always waiting its turn. And yet, they held on. What's perhaps most incredible is not the suffering, but the persistence, the refusal to give in, the refusal to let winter be the end of the story, the stubbornness of survival. Peasants patched holes in their roofs with mud even when their hands bled from the cold. They banked fires until the ashes turned gray with effort. They huddled under 5 layers of filth and goat fur and said, not tonight. Every sunrise was a win. Every spring was a miracle. They didn't ask for warmth, just a chance. The lessons they left. They didn't write books. They didn't build palaces. They didn't wear crowns. But their legacy lives on in every warm home, in every insulated coat, in every full pantry and flickering flame. Because before comfort was a right, it was a battle, one they fought every year, one ember, one breath, one stubborn heartbeat at a time. We've wandered through the smoke-filled huts, trudged across frozen floors, shared beds with chickens and prayers with shivering hands. We've seen how medieval peasants fought winter not with technology or wealth, but with community, cunning, and willpower. And now we step into the light beyond the storm, because their story doesn't end with suffering. It ends with legacy, a life of stone, straw, and hope. Imagine your entire life wrapped in gray. Gray skies, gray soil, gray breath in the cold morning. Yet somehow, In that monotone world, medieval peasants found color, not in silk or art, but in survival itself. They didn't need museums. Their legacy was built in rituals, routines, and resilience. The ember that became tradition, every fire they protected, every trick they taught their children, every mat of rushes laid, every prayer whispered, every goat brought inside, all of it became the foundation of human endurance. Those smoky, freezing nights taught generations the most vital lesson of all. You do not give up. The winter that forged community, it wasn't just about the individual. In winter, peasants didn't survive alone. They survived together, and in that togetherness, they laid the groundwork for something bigger than themselves. Community-based survival, culture. One ember, shared. If your neighbor's fire went out, you brought embers. If a widow's roof leaked, someone patched it. If a baby cried through the cold, mothers gathered to swaddle. They didn't have social programs or emergency hotlines. They had each other, and it worked, because one ember, shared, could reignite a whole home. From firekeepers to first responders, that instinct to help in the night never left us. You see it now in firefighters, in paramedics, in snowstorm volunteers who shovel their neighbors' walks or deliver groceries to the elderly. That ancient idea that someone must stay awake so others may rest was born in medieval huts, and it lives on. The power of ritual peasants didn't have written philosophy, but they understood ritual power. Everything had a rhythm: banking the fire, layering clothes, cooking dense meals, wrapping straw, breathing through wool. In a chaotic, deadly world, these rituals weren't just habit, they were armor against uncertainty. The order in chaos. These repeated actions said, even when nothing else is certain, this we do. That mindset still lingers in us today, in bedtime routines, in winter checklists, in the comfort of making tea when you're scared or sick. It's ancient, it's deep, and it's peasant-born. Filth as function, they didn't know the word microbiome, but medieval peasants understood something scientists would prove centuries later. You can't always scrub your way to safety. Dirt, defense. Their dirty clothes trapped heat. Their smoke-filled lungs were less prone to flea-borne illness. Their avoidance of cold baths kept their immune systems stronger. We now know that obsessive sterility can sometimes backfire, killing helpful bacteria and weakening resistance. But medieval peasants, they used dirt strategically. It was disgusting. It was genius. It was survival. The science of suffering. Somewhere in those drafty huts, proto-scientists were born. They didn't wear lab coats. They wore goat hair cloaks. But they were constantly experimenting. What keeps the wind out? What breathes better? Wool or linen? Does warm cabbage help you sleep longer? Does goat breath keep feet from freezing? Through endless trial, error, and bitter experience, peasants developed a working system of practical winter science. No textbooks, just frozen fingers and observational grit. The sleep strategy that worked modern sleep research has validated many ancient instincts: sleeping in shifts, controlling breath, heavy meals before bed, positioning yourself near radiant heat. All of it is now backed by data. But medieval peasants didn't need data. They needed survival. and they figured it out. The forgotten architects of comfort. Today, we live in homes so insulated we complain if it drops below 20 degrees Celsius. We have smart thermostats, weighted blankets, memory foam, and hot chocolate on demand. We forget, or never knew, that every inch of that comfort was built on someone else's hardship. From dung hut to dream house, we live in homes that are warm because peasants lived in homes that were not. We value community because peasants proved that isolation was death. We develop coats that trap heat because peasants layered grime over wool until they couldn't bend their arms. Everything we have now, it came from them. The death that shaped life. Death was no stranger to medieval winters. It came with the frost, with the cough, with the bad harvest. But in the shadow of death, life learned to stretch. Peasants lived slowly, deliberately. They appreciated sun. They celebrated turnips. They told stories by firelight and looked at one another with the soft, tired gratitude of, we're still here. That's what winter gave them, and that's what they gave us. The bloodline of resilience. You, reading this now, warm, awake, safe, are the descendant of someone who didn't give up, someone who lay in a straw bed and held their child through a night so cold they could barely breathe, someone who got up anyway, fed the fire, breathed through their nose, rubbed sheep, fat on the door cracks, and survived, not because they wanted to be remembered, but because they couldn't bear to give in. The ancestor, in the firelight. The next time you hear the wind outside, feel the walls hold steady, and watch the flame flicker safely behind glass. Remember them, the nameless, the shivering, the stubborn. They are in your bones. They are in your warmth. They are in every blanket, every roof beam, every quiet miracle of a house that holds. They lived the night so you could live the dream. The final image, a hut, smoky, cracked, filled with the slow rhythm of breath. Outside, the wind claws at the walls. Inside, a child stirs. A mother adds wood to the fire. A father checks the rags in the doorframe. A goat shifts beside the hearth. They don't speak. They don't sleep. But they endure. Because they must. Because someone always must. So that one day, far in the future, you might sit in comfort and remember